defense items. I would be very pleased to present my fellow panelists, starting with Gönül Tol, who is a senior fellow at MEI focusing on Turkish politics. Yulia Joja, who also is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, focusing on European and Black Sea security. And Jason Campbell, our last but not least, senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, focusing on international security, geopolitics, and foreign policy. So we are going to get started. Each of our panelists are going to give a brief opening remarks. We're going to have some moderated Q&A for 30 or 40 minutes. And please do go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A chat. I will get to those during the Q&A portion of today's event. And a reminder that this event is on the record and is being recorded. Thanks so much. Gönül, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Missy. Yeah, so the title of today's panel is The Future of Turkey's Defense Sector. And with my colleagues today, we will be mainly discussing the challenges that Turkey's defense sector faces. And if we were holding this panel in 2016, we would be praising how Turkish defense sector is doing, how it's facing lots of opportunities. The reason why we are today talking about challenges is it comes down to something that happened in 2017. So in 2017, Turkey decided to purchase the Russian missile defense system S-400s. And right now, many problems that Turkey's the defense sector faces is due to that decision, historic decision to purchase the S-400s. We now have, I think the biggest challenge is Turkey now has an engine problem, which creates a lot of vulnerability because Turkey, for many decades, it was considered the most advanced air power in its region. And right now, that's not the case. It desperately needs fifth generation jets. And that's not going to happen anytime soon. Because of that decision, the S-400 decision, the United States slapped sanctions, CAATSA sanctions, and there's another piece of legislation, the NDAA, that was approved in 2020. So these two pieces of legislation creates a lot of problems for Turkey's defense sector because the future Turkish policymakers basically planned Turkey's future defense on the assumption that Turkey was going to get the F-35s. So all plans had been made based on that decision. But because of the S-400 question, Turkey got kicked out of the F-35 program, and it cannot secure the F-35s that it had paid for. Turkey purchased 6 F-35s. Now they're in storage here in the United States, and Turkey cannot get them. And the alternative plan was to build its own indigenous fighter jet, which is called Kaan. So now Turkish officials are saying that, downplaying the aftermath of S-400, saying that, we will build our own and it will be ready by 2032. But defense sector analysts that I spoke with say that it's not a reasonable time frame. It will probably take by mid 2030s for Turkey to be able to produce its own for its own jets. And in the meantime, there is this gap, right? Right now, Turkey doesn't have F-35s. It won't even have the F-16s, by the way. It has an aging fleet. And it lives in a region where the Greeks got approval from Congress to get F-35s. Israel has F-35s. So that creates a lot of problems and vulnerability on Turkey's part. So why did Erdogan make that decision? I think it was partly due to frustration with the United States. It was partly because of his plans in Syria, which required Russian cooperation. So Erdogan decided that he wanted to cultivate closer ties with Putin, so he would have a freer hand in Syria, and purchasing the S-400s was, I think, part of that. And it was partly about his domestic calculations, because let's remember the decision to purchase the S-400s came shortly after the failed coup in 2016. And I think part of the reason was that Erdogan was personally afraid that he could be attacked by his own air force. So buying the S-400s, I think, was partly a response to that. So now, even looking at this whole thing from the point of view of Turkish policymakers, and when I say that, I talk about Turkish military too. I think buying the S-400s was a huge mistake. But Turkey turning to alternative suppliers, or Turkey wanting to diversify its defense partnership, is not unprecedented. Turkey always wanted to have these diversified partners on the defense front. It always wanted to build its own indigenous defense sector. And there were many ups and downs in Turkey's relationship with the United States, which really forced Turkey to double down on its efforts to be independent of the West. So these are not unprecedented since, I would say, the inception of the Republic in 1923. These factors were always there. I mean, if you look at the interwar years, 1919 to 1938, Turkey had relative freedom, cultivated ties with everyone. During the Second World War too, I mean, Turkey was actively neutral and wanted to buy military parts from all sides. Starting from 1960s, I think if you look at Turkey's relationship with the United States, there is this key moment, late 1940s, when Turkey decided that it really had to ally itself closely with the United States. There was an agreement in 1947, and that was partly because of this threat perception vis-a-vis the Soviets, right? So that led to closer defense partnership with the United States, but that relationship was never without any problems. A very important date was in 1964, and that was after this communal violence erupted on the island of Cyprus. President Johnson wrote this famous letter to Turkish president, basically warning Turkey not to use US-made military equipment. So that really had a huge impact on Turkey's military planning, on Turkey's foreign policy direction. And then came another date, that was in 1975, when the United States imposed this arms embargo. And now let's remember, until the 1970s, we're talking about a country, Turkey was incredibly dependent on US equipment. So that was such a sobering moment when the Turks realized, we cannot rely on the United States for our defense needs. So we have to double down on our efforts to build our own indigenous defense sector, and we just have to find alternative partners. And no wonder, after the Johnson letter, Turkey decided to improve its relationship with the Soviet Union. And then came 1980s and 90s, when Turkey decided to diversify that partnerships, engage more international actors in its defense needs. There was this model of joint venture, for example. So I wanted to just put everything, that S-400 decision into perspective. I know many of us think that it's unprecedented, but there's always been that tension with the United States and complications in that relationship that always forced Turkey to seek alternative partnerships. So S-400 in many ways came against that background, although there were other, I think, reasons involved. So throughout those years, until the AKP emerges, until Erdogan becomes this leading figure, throughout those years, Turkey always wanted to invest in its defense sector. But because of the gap between the political elite and the military elite, and also because of financial problems, the defense sector couldn't really take off. That happened until under Erdogan. So that's why I think, I mean, as someone who is very critical of Erdogan's policies, I think we should give credit to him as the guy who really boosted that long time effort to develop Turkey's defense sector. And I think it was mainly because of he brought Turkish military under control, so he solved that problem. And also financially, Turkey was there were improvements on that front too. So all those things really helped Erdogan to do what he's done with Turkey's defense sector. And also, I think he made a personal decision to focus less on those joint venture model and focus more on local contractors. That also helped Turkish defense sector take off under his rule. So that's why, starting from 2010s, we see Turkey started reaping the benefits of all that thinking, all that transformation, and Turkey became this rising defense actor. And the products that it's producing have become very attractive to foreign buyers. And mainly because I think Turkish military, one of the key reasons was Turkish military's experience in fighting the PKK in diverse environments. So that was a plus. And second, these Turkish defense factors, they are the high standard. You know, Turks, when they were producing this, they adhered to these NATO standards, which made them a lot more attractive than competitors, and they're cost effective, right? So that's why Turkey has become this major exporter. And until I think Turkey purchased the S-400s, Turkish defense sector was doing excellent, and now it has this problem. And Erdogan wants to solve this problem, and that's one of the key issue and on his agenda when he met with President Trump recently. He really thought with a friendly person in the White House that he could solve the problems facing Turkey's efforts to cultivate closer defense ties with the United States. And I think President Trump pledged support. Now, Trump cannot do, I know Jason will talk about these, Trump cannot really solve the NDAA problem, but there are things that he can do with CAATSA. And I think that's what Turks have been pushing him to do. And during the meeting in the Oval Office, Trump said that if he wanted to, he could lift the CAATSA sanctions immediately. But I think during the meeting with Erdogan, he tied that to Turkey stopping buying Russian oil, and that's a huge ask. So right now we are back to square one, where Turkey has this huge engine problem. And Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan said, you know, if Americans don't sell us these engines and other critical parts, we have alternatives. And I think the hint there was Russia and China. But I doubt Turkey has alternatives, and I doubt Russia and China can actually fill in the gap, because we're talking about an ecosystem that was designed around the F-35s. So just purchasing Russian engines or Chinese engines is just not going to do it. And without solving the CAATSA problem, Turkey is looking at a major problem here. And I'll end with this. There are other problems. I think, yes, Erdogan did a great job in terms of boosting defense production, but also some of the policies, aside from the S-400, some of the other missteps that he has taken, now defense sector faces challenges. One of them is brain drain. I speak with a lot of engineers who work for Turkish defense companies, state defense companies, many of them in the last few years. They fled the country. They are now in Europe, working for German companies, Dutch companies. They are really frustrated with the political climate in the country. They are frustrated that even the defense sector is being stuffed with Erdogan loyalists, people who don't know what they're doing. So that brain drain, I think, is something that we don't talk about often, but I think it's going to have a direct impact on the future of Turkey's defense sector. And the other thing, misstep is financial problems. I think Turkish economy is not doing great, and mainly because of Erdogan's wrong policies. So now that financial problems has finally reached Turkey's defense sector, and it will have an impact on its future. And finally, again, I'll say this to sum up. I know Turkey wants to be a strategically autonomous actor. That's been the case for many decades. But for Turkey to get there, and when I say strategic autonomy, obviously it's strategic autonomy from the West. So Turkey wants to be strategically autonomous from the West. And for Turkey to get there, it depends on the West. And that's Turkey's dilemma. And that dependency on the West for its defense needs means Turkey really has to align its foreign policy with the West. And I see that again as a huge problem. Erdogan has been trying to mend ties with the West, with Washington, but I think there's also a lot of skepticism in Western capitals now. After having seen Turkey purchase the S-400s and other steps Erdogan has taken on the foreign and domestic policy front, the Western partners are skeptical. And that is also a big problem. And I'll end it there.
Thanks so much, Gunul. Before we move on to Jason, I just want to ask you one follow-up. And for you and Yulia and Jason, feel free to jump in too. The S-400, you mentioned obviously the geopolitical reasons that Turkey decided to acquire it, the kind of geographic neighborhood reasons. But from a purely defense perspective, what value, if any, has the S-400 provided to Turkey since it was purchased?
Zero value. It's become a liability.
Mhm.
Look, I mean, Erdogan, the Turkish officials, the reasons that they cited when they decided to purchase the S-400s, they said, this wasn't our first choice. We wanted to buy the Patriots, but Americans were dragging their feet. They didn't want to share technology, and the price was too high. But I know from my contacts with the US administration that that was not the case. And besides, Russians are not sharing any technology either. And Americans at the time, when they were discussing, they were negotiating about the Patriots. I know that the Americans have provided a very competitive price. And technology sharing, yes, that wasn't maybe on the table as much as Erdogan would want it, but with S-400s either. So that's why I think it was a huge misstep. It was a huge mistake. And from a defense point of view, it not only didn't have any value, it's become a major liability.
Okay, great. All right, I'm going to turn it over to you to Jason to make sure we get enough time for everyone. Go ahead.
Thanks, Missy. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I'll very quickly just touch on some of the more, I guess, defense specific issues in the context over the last few decades in Turkey without sort of covering the same ground that Gunul mentioned. I will say though that the 1975 arms embargo on Turkey imposed by the U.S. Really had a not just an impact among the political and military elite in Turkey, but really at a societal level demonstrated that they were going to have to increase their ability to be more independent when it came to their defense. Because you saw in very short time, following nearly 2 decades of U.S. provision of defense equipment, that some of the deterioration in their navy and some of their armor, their communications equipment was very rapid, and I think that really impacted the successive governments to the current day. And as Gunnar mentioned, in the early 1980s, you had in the context of the U.S. deteriorating relations with the Soviets in 79 and 80. You had a new agreement, a cooperation agreement signed with Turkey that they were able to very quickly leverage into greater access to U.S. and European defense technologies and equipment, and through their JV model, were able to domestically start building some of the kit assemblies for F-16s and other equipment throughout the 80s, and learning that not just gaining access to some of this equipment, but learning how to manage a defense industry and how to build it. And you saw this in the mid 1980s, the establishment of an Undersecretariat for Defense Industries, which was a civilian-led organization that kind of helped bridge the gap between military and civilian. And you'll see this exist to the current day, although in a more pronounced fashion. And then in the 1990s, Turkey's able to not just be solely an importer of goods, but start looking further afield, and had a lot of success in the 90s in exporting its goods throughout the Muslim world. Algeria, Indonesia, Jordan, Malaysia, the GCC states. So it really establishes some of the partnerships that will continue to be valuable for them going forward. And this all set up nicely in 2002, as Gunil stated. Justin Development Party (AKP) comes to power. Shortly after that, the Turks under Erdogan essentially scrap the JV model for one that is more focused on what was often called indigenous solutions. And you've had now with Erdogan's, as prime minister and now president, more than 2 decades of this, consistent political will behind building the defense industry in Turkey. And through that, you see in the 2010s, it starts growing, expanding its reach in defense exports. And you see here that the UAVs really become an area where Turkey was one of the first mass producers of military UAVs, and really got a very strong foothold in the international market. As early as 2012, you saw Qatar become its first customer abroad with some of these mini handheld UAVs. And by 2019, you had the Bayraktar TB2 armed UAV, which was, and I believe still is, the number one selling military UAV in the world. Also during this time in 2019, Ukraine becomes an important partner, both as a customer of UAVs from Turkey, but also as a supplier of some of its much needed engines that supported not only subsequent models of military UAVs, but also some of its attack helicopters and other things. So again, a non-NATO supplier of very much needed defense equipment in that time. And importantly, you saw in this 2016 to 2018 phase, the Undersecretariat for Defense Industries actually became elevated to its own agency that reported directly to President Erdogan through what's called the Defense Executive Committee, or excuse me, the Defense Industry Executive Committee. So now you had this agency that reports directly to the president. It is formally listed as a holding company. It has a separate budget from the Defense Ministry, and has been really able to wield a good amount of influence. And with that came again, Turkey now seeing itself become sort of the prime component of joint venture agreements with some of its customers, where it's providing some of the technology and know-how to its partners. Again, Azerbaijan, Jordan, Malaysia, Pakistan, even places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. It's able to be part of these joint ventures and expand its footprint. And what we've seen now is the growth has been pretty pronounced in recent years. Again, some of its UAV sales have expanded to Eastern European NATO members. Defense exports were just about 2 billion in 2014. They were 5.5 billion in 2023. And this year, the expectations are for this year, it'll exceed 6 billion just this year. And we've also seen defense exports grow as a percentage of the global defense exports. Turkey was just a few years ago, less than 0.5%, and now it's at 1.6% of global defense exports. You're also seeing that its broader defense budget grow as a result. From 2019 to 2024, its defense budget doubled from 20 billion to 40 billion. The number of people that are employed in the defense sector has also more than doubled since 2016, with nearly 100,000 people now employed in Turkey in the defense industry. And to go over, some of the issues that, or the factors that make, Turkish defense material appealing, as Gunal stated, the heightened standards, at or near NATO standards, which makes them, in most cases, a better option than Chinese or Russian options. From a price perspective, they tend to undercut U.S. and your other European defense providers. They tend to be more speedy in how they provide the provision of some of their defense material. They have very minimal end use conditions, so they don't ask a lot of questions, and in some cases, that has gotten them into some geopolitical trouble when they find that some of their equipment is being used by both sides of a conflict. And as Gunnar said, they're battlefield tested. So not only in their internal um, uh, conflict with the PKK, but you saw early on their drones perform well in Libya, Syria, Ukraine, and Azerbaijan. So people are able to see that their equipment actually functions well. And now to conclude with some of the limitations, of this industry. As Gunnar said, regardless of the investments being made and the advancements being made, the Turkish industry is still reliant on U.S. and other Western components for some of its more advanced projects. So engines, transmission systems, microchips, and a lot of issues still remain from the S-400 and subsequent CAATSA sanctions. And I think not only Gunnar, mentioned the most recent meeting between Trump and Erdogan here a few weeks ago in late September, and how there was helpful rhetoric that has not yet led to material benefit. We also saw this back in 2017 and 18 when it appeared that Erdogan thought that he would be able to engage, on a one-on-one basis with President Trump during his first term to get a waiver for both the S-400 purchase and to remain in the F-35 program, neither of which came to fruition. So once again, and even back then, Trump, talked about how it was unfair that Turkey had been pushed out of the F-35 program, but ultimately relented when Congress stepped in and elected to sanction them under the CAATSA. So we'll see what happens here in the coming weeks and months, but this wouldn't be the first time that Trump had positive sounding rhetoric that ultimately didn't provide the benefit that Turkey hoped for. And again, with going to the fifth generation warfighter, the Khan, I don't want to repeat a lot of the things Gunnar brought up. Only that, yeah, you're talking about Turkey is working on its own engine. It's going to be the early 2030s, at least before that TF-35,000 is ready for production. And as European alternatives are technically out there, but would require a redesign of the Khan as it currently is to fit the dual engines. And as she said, the Chinese-Russian alternatives would, likely not be better and would invite just more Western sanctions. So we'll see what happens there. I would note too that, they weren't prominent countries, but just earlier this month, the U.S. sanctioned, 9 Turkish companies, among others from China and the UAE, for facilitating the purchase of American electronic components found in weaponized drones, operated by Iran-backed groups. So this includes the Houthis and Hamas. So again, it was not a lot of detail provided yet, but this is something worth watching, and it just demonstrates that, sometimes this willingness and sometimes pressure to expand the defense industry in Turkey can lead to it making some some choices among actors that ultimately have strategic impact on Turkish security. And finally, I'll say that all these issues notwithstanding, Turkey is still very ambitious when it comes to building its defense industry. They're now talking about a steel dome project that pulls together a number of Turkish defense interests to provide a short, medium, and long range air and missile defense. Not unlike the Iron Dome we see in Israel, and a similar one being planned for the United States. So some of these issues notwithstanding, it is still pressing forward on trying to be among the handful of technological advanced exporters of defense material, and I'll stop there.
Oh, I need to unmute myself. Apologies. Thanks, Jason. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Yulia. And then when you're finished, we're going to do a couple of sort of moderated Q&A before opening it up to the group.
Sounds good. Thank you, Missy. Jason already made my job very easy because he covered the United States. Gunut had talked to that too. And then also the sales of Turkey outside the West, so to speak. So what I want to do is to drill down a little bit into Turkey-Europe ties, because that gets less on the radar, more under the radar, particularly here in Washington. But it's incredibly important for Turkey, primarily, I would argue, but also for the other side, for Europe. Turkey has been, with all the pressures that Gunut and Jason have been describing, have been trying really hard, policymakers, to break into the European, so NATO market, which is extremely lucrative, right? That's where the money is and the contracts. And then on the other hand, they've been trying, as was kind of alluded to before, to access Western technology that is not available from the United States, and mostly Europeans are following the United States, but there's always loopholes, right? And so Turkey has been trying over the last few years kind of this double effort to sell to European countries to break into the NATO market, as well as, whereas with the United States, obviously, we're not buying a lot of Turkish equipment. And then on the other hand, to access technology, including fighter jets. And they're making progress here and there, but it's a lot of back and forth, and it's a little bit more complicated than the bilateral US tie because you have so many European players. So I'm not going to go through even the majority of them, just a couple of them, but I'm going to try to highlight sort of the efforts on the two sides of the sword, if you'd like, that I'm describing. So before I go into the details, the last thing that I want to mention sort of as a preface is that also Ankara has, and that throws us a little bit also into the future for the conversation that we're about to have, that Ankara has a bit of a history of playing off major powers, right? We've seen that with Russia and the S-400 in the United States. They've been flirting with China too, and President Erdogan has been tabling that, including in recent weeks. And as Europe is beefing up its military under circumstances of extraordinary pressure, we should also take into account future scenarios in which Turkey is attempting to play off the two sides of the Atlantic in getting the better deals for the national interests of Ankara. So what do I mean then by European militaries beefing up? For the first time, again, under these extraordinary pressures, if you'd like, from East and West, defense budgets in Europe have been soaring. We all have seen over the last few months the NATO commitment, 3.5% and total of 5%. But that's building up to what has already been taking place across Europe. And then specifically for the European Union, this is where the new elements come in. The European Union has, for the first time after a history of essentially no spending on defense, has been earmarking 800 billion euros for defense spending among member states. And out of those, 150 billion are in very advantageous loans. These loans are available for European Union member states, but there's carve-outs. And so the United States is looking into that because we want to keep selling our equipment in Europe and others too. And for Turkey, that's extremely relevant. And so this is maybe the most important deadline that we're looking at the end of next month, November 30th, is when the deadline is running out for accessing or for applying to these SAFE loans, Security Action for Europe. It's an acronym, but SAFE means essentially these $150 billion loans. And so, needless to say, Ankara has been trying really hard, and that is very much in the making. To give you an idea of the pressure on each side, the Germans have been changing the constitution, their own constitution, to permit for these debts and loans. And the German policymakers have been traveling this week to Athens to pressure Greece into lifting their veto against Turkey, right? The traditional veto. And so this is very much in the making. And then we have additional pressure from particularly Central and Eastern European countries that have now a history of working well with Turkey and that have incentive. They want Turkey to be more involved on the ground, Black Sea security and beyond. And they've been shopping significantly, Romania, Poland, some others from Turkey over the last few years. Less so drones, more armored vehicles and stuff like that. But nevertheless, the sums are important. So this is kind of the general image of the political pressure and the political context that we're looking at. And then there's also some additional highlights that show how much interest there is on the two sides. In June this year, Turkey and the European Defense Arm officials have been meeting up for the first time in many years. In April this year, Turkey has joined the 3Cs initiative that essentially means accessing some smaller funding for infrastructure, but also defense projects. In 2024, last year, Turkey, under pressure, has agreed for the first time for a Black Sea operation that does not include Russia, so kind of pushback against Russia, and that is enabling counter or minesweeping in the context of the war in Ukraine. And so with all of this data and all of this pressure over the last few months or the last year, when the Europeans are looking at Turkey, they're seeing a growing exporter and a growing partner, especially in drones, in armored vehicles, and in aerospace. And Turkey, too, wants to penetrate the NATO market and has been really breaking in, particularly over the last year. In 2024, 55% of defense exports of Turkey have been going to NATO countries plus Ukraine. Jason already highlighted how important Ukraine is. They're obviously buying a lot right now. And then the Europeans have additional pressure because of the concern of weakening security guarantees under NATO. So they see Turkey's fast-growing industry, but also the fact that it is the second largest armed force in NATO as pluses towards strategic autonomy, towards investing more into defense, and frankly, less dependence on the United States. And then Turkey also, as I mentioned, wants stuff from the Europeans, and the access has been challenged due to sanctions from the United States, and not only political reluctance of some member states, more important member states of the European Union, but in terms of exports to Turkey from European countries, the data also looks really promising. The biggest importers into Turkey of military sales are Spain, 34% of total acquisitions from Turkey, Italy. Germany has recently overtaken the United States. So that shows you that Turkey is really looking for alternatives in the European market. And of course, engines play the biggest role. And the biggest news here with the engine is just from over the summer, the last few months, that Turkey has, after a lot of back and forth, secured a deal with Eurojets, with Eurofighter jets, to buy 40 of them in total, but it needed the approval. They're co-produced by several European countries, and it needed the approval of Germany, and Germany has just greenlit this. So that's fourth generation fighter jets, and the access to the engines is not entirely detailed yet, but that's an important milestone for Turkey to be able to access engines. They need fifth generation as a priority, but they also need fourth generation and training jets, and even for the Bayraktar drones, they want to diversify away from Ukraine and into more reliable markets. The last thing that I'll mention here is Italy, particularly relevant for drones. Last year, Turkish drone manufacturer Baykar, so the famous Bayraktars, there's even a song in Ukrainian about the Bayraktar drones. That manufacturer has acquired a company, an aerospace company in Italy, Piaggio, and also signed several other deals that basically mean that Turkey is breaking into the Western market for drone sales. So far, they've been selling in the Balkans, in other places, but not really Western Europe, or obviously not the United States. So there's some important progress here in the ties to Italy and beyond. And so I'll stop right here, and we can go more into the details on the European side. Just one bit, because we kept talking about Russia, and I think we're going to come back to it. And I've seen some questions on that. Recently, just the last few days, I've seen media headlines, particularly in the Turkish media, that Russia is trying to buy back the S-400 because they have shortages. Now, even though we're coming now full circle back, it's still a big ethical problem, right? Because Turkey selling back the S-400 would rid itself of the bilateral problem and the NATO problem. But that would mean that obviously Russia would use them in the war against Ukraine, and Russia is using defensive equipment even for offensive purposes, even though they're technically not ideal for that. So it might be an option for Turkey right now to get rid of the S-400, but I wouldn't say it's the one that will lead to applause among Western partners.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Julie. I have a couple of questions, and then we only have about 16, 18 minutes. So I'll do some audience questions. But for any of you all, can you talk a little bit about where these recent Russian incursions into NATO airspace, the drones that went into Poland, the Russian jet incursions into Estonian airspace, the Denmark thing, what does that mean for Turkey as a country that, yes, is supplying Ukraine and is, this increasingly attractive destination for European defense shoppers, but also someone who has, among the most positive relations with Russia in NATO, along with Hungary and Slovakia? What does that do to that sort of crescendo of the competition and the potential conflict between NATO and Russia? Can you talk a little bit about that, anyone?
Well, I think Yulia is best placed to answer this question, Missy, but let me say let me say this. I think invasion of Ukraine has opened a window of opportunity for Turkey. And since then, we've been seeing Turkey tilting more towards the West. And by the West, I mean Europe. Yes, Erdogan was here at the White House, and he sought Trump's support to solve those sanctions problems. For now, I don't think it's going anywhere. Because there's a lot of pushback. I saw one of the questions, audience questions. There's a lot of pushback on the Hill against sale of F-35s. And one thing that I forgot to mention is Turkey had already signed this deal with Lockheed Martin to purchase F-16s. And at the last minute, Turkey decided not to buy the F-16s. And I think the thinking in Ankara was that these F-16s are very expensive. We're struggling financially, so why don't we earmark that money towards Kaan? So that's why they conveyed this to the American side, and people like Lindsey Graham, they did not like this, saying that if Turkey backs down on the F-16s, that they won't even talk about the F-35s. So all of this to say that the American part of that defense problem is still there. That's why Turkey will be focusing more on the European side. And I think that's a good thing. But here is the problem. And Yulia mentioned this. Turkey wants to tap into safe and cultivate closer ties. But this all comes down to how Turkey must align its defense policy with its foreign policy. Because I think right now there is a gap. On the one hand, you have Turkey that has found itself in the middle of conflicts and selling weapons and drones to both parties. I mean, from Ethiopia and Egypt to Morocco and Algeria and Kyrgyzstan. So Turkey is all over the place in terms of defense, sale of defense products. And I think there is no mechanism and policy in place that aligns those sales, defense sales, with Turkey's foreign policy. And that will create a liability. That's number one. So what does that say about Turkish-European ties? On the defense side, Turkey clearly needs to rely on Europe. But on the policy side, because Erdogan, in European views, Erdogan has made so many mistakes that there's reluctance on the European side. It's good news that Germany greenlit the sale of Eurofighters, but still Turkey has a Europe foreign policy problem. And I know Erdogan is trying to fix those, but so many mistakes have been made so far that it's not going to be easy. And I'll stop there.
All right, anyone else on my question?
I'm happy to add a little bit. Gönül already described really well the political context. If I would be very uncensored, I would say it's toxic on both sides. There's a lot of issues that need to be untangled, and the Europeans don't really know what to make of Turkey's changes vis-a-vis Russia that are important. And they frankly don't often know what to make of themselves in terms of geopolitical actors. So just this morning, I was on a panel under the European institutions talking about some of these things. A lot of questions were on Turkey, but it seemed to me that people still don't know what to make of it and don't have a clear plan. What does that mean for the drone issue specifically? I would say it's complicated because yes, Ankara has been having very close ties with Russia, and President Trump, here to his credit, has really put his finger on it when he highlighted the energy issue. But on the other hand, the military cooperation that Jason has mentioned with Ukraine specifically, the non-recognition of Crimea, the fact that they're building drones together, Turkey is building ships, military ships for Ukraine, that all plays in favor of Turkey. The problem generally, and Turkey is the only one that has shot down Russian jets. The rest of the Europeans have not been able to so far and haven't had the political will, most likely from what we've seen from NATO Secretary General recently. And so the technical problem that all of them have, whether it's Turkey or Europe, is they just don't have the technical means to shoot down drones that are made in Iran or with with Iranian technology and used by Russia. And so I think the key here is in Ukraine. They're the ones that are fastest in developing this. And that opens up a lot of opportunities for Turkey to work with Ukraine and then access also European markets through that. So that would be my advice if someone in Ankara would ask.
I'm going to pull one of the questions from the feed that we have here. This is from Hugo Lafitte from the French Embassy. Why can't a fifth generation jet from Europe, like the French Rafale, fit into the Erdogan defense strategy designed for F-35? What makes it so different? You did mention the Eurofighter, one of you guys did, so maybe we've addressed this a little bit, but anybody want to take a swing at that?
Jason, I think you can talk about it
Sure.
most eloquently.
Sure. I mean, without getting too much into the technical aspect, because there are some debates on the extent to which the Khan is meets the fifth generation requirements, and consensus are that theoretically it does or could, and whether or not that can compete with the Rafale or the Typhoon or the certainly the F-35, some of these other uh, uh, options out there. I think what hits me is that it almost, I don't say it doesn't matter, but from a political standpoint, the independence and success of the Turkish defense industry is very much interwoven with the political rhetoric of Erdogan and the AKP. So the pursuit of a fifth generation fighter in this case brings with it a certain value that I think goes beyond the costs of doing so, or the whether or not it can compete. The other thing I would say too is that, as I discussed in my remarks, is that Turkey has an advantage over a lot of these other top producers in that they are established within the Muslim world. They've, for now, 30 plus years in many cases, have established defense relationships from, Libya in the west to Malaysia and Indonesia in the east and many of the places in between. And we've seen even Indonesia has already made a commitment to purchasing, I believe, 40 of the Khan, if and when they're able to be mass produced. I know the initial goal was 2028, but now it looks like it's going to be further down. So I think given those factors, that all kind of comes into it, and it's less about whether or not it'll ultimately be incrementally better or worse than another of the options that it has that nationalistic sort of factor that is probably playing a larger impact here than it is in other places.
Let me ask you guys this, as somebody who's spent a lot of time writing and thinking about the U.S. defense sector and a defense industrial base. How is Turkey able to produce all this gear so quickly when that is something that eludes the United States? It takes us 30 years to produce one kind of develop and produce one kind of new plane. The Patriot production stream is very slow. How has Turkey cracked this problem here?
Well, it has a good manufacturing base, and it's been working on it for decades now. So I think, again, I mean, people tend to give credit only to Erdogan for building Turkey's defense industry. But the most competent firms that were established were in the 1970s, this TUSAŞ and Aselsan and others. So there's a long history there that we here in Washington and the West don't recognize. So there was a time when Turkish engineers were just over the top. They got good education. And they invested a lot in this field. So that's what I'm talking about when I say Erdogan has been reaping the benefits of all this, but at the same time, he's undermining with Turkish engineers just fleeing the country, Turkish education system being destroyed by Erdogan's policies. I mean, Turkish universities are not what they used to be, unfortunately. and the financial problems. So all those, and also politicization. And I must add this, we don't talk about this. You know, when Erdogan came to power, there were all these construction companies around him. So he granted all government contracts to his cronies in the construction sector, right? So now that kind of dried up, that sector, and now all these construction companies, people close to Erdogan, are now rushing into the defense sector without the know-how. These companies, they've never been operated in the defense sector, and yet they are getting government contracts. So that is another thing that will really jeopardize the future of Turkey's defense sector.
I would guess, though, that there is some sort of spillover or positive externalities in the fact, I think, as you referenced at the beginning, Gönül, like that, you know, Turkey just has a much more robust manufacturing sector than the United States does at this stage. And that seems to be maybe the biggest challenge for the US defense industrial base. Okay, we have time probably for one more question or maybe two. Ali Turanli asks about FPV and low-cost tactical drones. How is Turkey doing in this regard, some of these things that we're now seeing in the highest demand in Ukraine?
Okay, I'll take that. Just to say, you know, that's an excellent question. It's one that I don't know a lot about. It's, you know, the not just the technology, but I think the manufacturing of this is happening so fast. I mean, we're in a, you know, in a position where Iran is now a major producer of smaller low cost drones and working closely with the Russians in Crimea even. So it's an area where I'm aware of, but I don't know, based on the recent, you know, I guess Turkish industrial, the large contracts being signed with, you know, the $3 billion contract signed a couple of years ago with the Saudis was for the Akinci UAV, a big, larger UAV, attack UAV. The big contracts for Turkey at least seem to be in this, you know, medium to larger military UAVs and less on the smaller ones, though. I know there are companies that are involved. I just don't know the extent to which that's being a focus on in Turkey.
I
Okay.
can just add very quickly to that. The way we're looking now at this market is that the only ones that are doing well is Iranian production, very cheap, very efficient, and very workable when you look at how costly it is to shoot them down. And the Ukrainians developing them super fast and looking at something that the Iranians are not able to do. The Russians are essentially just copying. They're not really adding value to the current so-called kamikaze drones. And that is longer haul flights, right, to go deep into Russian territory. And so now we're actually in a situation where including here in the United States, we're learning from a post-Soviet country in how to build and adapt. For the Turks specifically, the Bayraktars, the famous ones, are pretty large drones, and they were very efficient in the first few months of the war. They really made a difference, hence the song, which is, by the way, fantastic, from Ukraine. But the Russians have been able to adapt to Bayraktar pretty quickly, and now the Ukrainians are not using them much anymore because they're able to shoot. The Russians are able to shoot them down pretty quickly, and they're expensive. And so I don't know of anything coming out at a relevant scale out of Turkey or anybody else really in the larger region that matches the needs on the battlefield right now.
Okay, just one. This is going to have to be one person and a 1 minute answer. I'm going to pick up Tom Waldwin's question about congressional attitudes at Turkey and Erdogan following the resignation of Menendez, the SFRC chairman, former chairman. I guess just to narrow that down a little bit, what are the prospects, if any, for congressional reversal on Katza and the overall the sort of crux of the S-400 F-35 question?
Well, there's there are a lot of people on the Hill who are very skeptical, and they all have their own agenda. Some are pissed at what Turkey is doing in Syria. Some really care, like Senator Van Hollen, senator from Maryland. He cares deeply about the Kurds, the Syrian Kurds. So he often criticizes Turkey on that. But he's one such figure who would block things when it comes to closer defense cooperation with the United States. You have Senator Shaheen, who's become somewhat more constructive, but there are a lot of people, Missy. That's the problem. I mean, you have Greeks who are opposed to this sale. You have the Israeli lobby because of what's happening between Israel and Turkey, and then there you have the Hamas angle there. So that's why whenever I go to the Hill, I come back with this feeling that this is so difficult to fix. And unfortunately, for many years, Turkey really neglected that angle. They always try to invest in this personal relationship with the American president, be it Biden, Trump first, and now Trump second. And I kept telling them, you cannot, don't think of Washington as Ankara. Well, now it looks much like Ankara, but there are other legs of government that you have to invest in. So you can't just be dealing with the White House and ignore the Congress. And that's what they've done. And I think that's why they're also paying a price.
All right. Well, listen, we got to leave it there to respect everyone's time, but I really want to thank our panelists, Golnur, Yulia, and Jason, and thank you to MEI for hosting this really interesting conversation. I learned a lot, and thanks to everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you.